Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit, welcome to this week's contemplations. This is for the week of June 3rd, 2024. And as always, I invite you to tune inwards as you're listening to my words and to feel into any sensations, any intuitive knowing, any emotions that come up for you, and to really co-create a space here with me where you can listen to what wants to bubble forth for you. So on Monday, June 3rd, we have the Sun in Gemini sextiling the North Node in Aries, and then Mercury will enter Gemini. On Tuesday, the 4th, we have Venus in Gemini sextiling the North Node in Aries. We have Mercury in Gemini trining Pluto in Aquarius. Mercury will also conjoin Jupiter in Gemini. And then the Venus and the Sun, will conjoin in Gemini. On Thursday the 6th, we have a new moon in Gemini, so a lot of Gemini energy. On Saturday the 8th, Venus in Gemini will square Saturn in Pisces. And on Sunday the 9th, the Sun in Gemini will square Saturn in Pisces, Mercury in Gemini will sextile the North Node in Aries, and then we have Mars entering Taurus. So that is a lot of different aspects happening, right? This is a very busy week. This is a very Gemini week. And it's interesting because even though we've been in Gemini season for a while, the Sun entered Gemini, I believe a couple weeks ago, we also have new movements in the Gemini realm of the sky, right? Because Mercury's ingress into Gemini, Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, right? Heightens the Gemini energy. And on top of that, we also have the new moon, right? Which means the Sun and the Moon will also kind of start a new cycle in Gemini. In other words, there are plenty of opportunities here to explore new thought patterns, new ways of being. There are plenty of opportunities to question the ways that we've always done certain things. And there are also opportunities for pollination, sharing learnings, findings, especially before they're fully cooked, right? At the same time, this week, Saturn also plays a big role. Saturn will be squaring Sun and Venus. And so with Saturn being in Pisces, we may become aware of the energetic restrictions that we place on our explorations. When we think about how Pisces is in a square to Gemini, right, we can feel into where are the places within us, in our psyche, or maybe sometimes even in the collective energies itself, that prevents this kind of playful game, right, that Gemini wants to engage in. We may want to ask ourselves, what are some of the old fears that are based on previous experiences that are holding us back from exploring new ways of being, right? What are some of the ways in which we have, our past experiences have crystallized into beliefs, into thought forms, into kind of energetic pathways, right, that hold us back from fully being in that magician energy that Gemini can really exude. I am remembering a conversation with a dear friend about his experience being criticized, made fun of in a very public way, and how that experience stopped him from sharing for a very long time, right? This is something that we have an opportunity to look at this coming week with the Venus Cazimi. I think there's something here about re-emerging from the shadows, right? About stepping into visibility in ways that are aligned with us. Venus Cazimi is a beautiful transit that can facilitate realizations about how we want to be seen and interacted with in ways that are pleasurable, that are reciprocal and loving, right? And sometimes realizations come through in like a really gentle, beautiful way. Other times realizations can be quite challenging. There can be something about realizations that feels like a call out a little bit, right? So I think both ends of the spectrum can be present this coming week. There's also an invitation here to watch the restrictions. Whenever we talk about Saturn, we talk about restrictions, we talk about boundaries, we talk about containers and rules, right? And to me, with all this Gemini placement, looking at the Saturn in Pisces, right? In that square, the opportunity here is to become an observer, to allow ourselves to look at these restrictions or obstacles as a student of the situation. Restrictions are limitations to movements, to access, to the ability of someone or something to move in the ways that they are drawn to, right? And a question to kind of play around this coming week may be, what does it mean for me to question restrictions without necessarily getting pulled into opposing, fighting, or breaking down the restrictions, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with opposing, fighting, or breaking down restrictions. It's simply that we may want to ask ourselves, is that how we want to choose to spend our energy? Is that how we want to tackle this particular restriction, right? Or are there other ways that we can allow our energies, our creativity to kind of be channeled to maybe even completely circumvent the restrictions altogether, right? Restrictions are often not as set in stone or as much of a grid as we believe them to be. There are many different ways to work with restrictions. We can breathe into them, right? Restrictions can sometimes feel suffocating because we're accustomed to maybe having a little bit more space. So there may be times or areas or relationships in your life where things are feeling restrictive, not because there's anything bad, but simply because maybe you are working with certain limits, right? And limits are not necessarily a bad thing. They're not automatically restrictive, right? Limits can feel restrictive, but ultimately limits can allow us to come to a realization of what actually matters to us. Limits can help us prioritize a little bit better. So sometimes there are restrictions that are uncomfortable in the beginning, but as we deepen into it and as we breathe into it, we can see ways of working with those restrictions that are generative, right? We can also play with the restrictions. We can maybe try to see if there's any wiggle room, if there's any space, right, for us to explore. The imagery in my mind is, if you're trying to buy a pair of pants and maybe you can check to see if the waistband is made of elastic material, right? In which case, maybe size doesn't matter as much, right? Often playing with restrictions, getting curious about restrictions can show us the feature of these restrictions. And in understanding the restrictions a little bit better, we can play with them and maybe even come up with really creative ways to work with the restrictions, right? I've been thinking, for example, as a songwriter, it's often really difficult for me to just write a song without having restrictions. It's much easier if I say, okay, I'm going to write a 4-minute song, right? It's going to follow the structure and it's going to be in this particular key. And then I can kind of flow, right? Whereas if somebody just says, just write anything for me, that can be a lot harder. So I want to bring in a personal reflection here around working with mercurial energy. I would consider myself a pretty mercurial person. I am a Virgo rising with a Gemini moon, and my ascendant ruler, Mercury, is in Pisces, right? So there's a lot of mutability in my chart. There's a lot of Mercury energy in my chart. And I believe it may be helpful as we enter this coming week to maybe understand some parameters, or maybe not even parameters, but for me to share some field notes about what I've learned working with the trickster, right? Or working with the trickster energy. So the first thing that came to my mind with regards to working with a trickster is that you really can't edit what you haven't written, right? I really wish this weren't true. I really wish that everything can be organized all the time, but that's just simply not the case. Often, if you want to get to a sense of order, we need to move through disorder, right? And to me, this is really reflected through Mercury ruling both Gemini and Virgo, and how Gemini and Virgo is in a square relationship, right? If you think about an author like Marie Kondo, for example, in The Magic of Tidying Up, there's the suggestion that she puts out in the book of taking out all of your belongings before organizing them. So let's say if you are trying to organize your closet full of your clothes, you're supposed to really take out all of your clothes and lay them out somewhere where you can see them, and then start organizing them, right? And similarly, we often need to allow our thoughts to be poured onto a paper, for our ideas to be expressed on a canvas if you are a painter, before you can reorganize it and turn it into maybe something that's a little bit more coherent, right? It's so much harder to organize what you cannot see and touch. And so, in other words, there is an opportunity here to really focus on creating a bad first draft, right? What would happen if you just give yourself the grace of starting with something that is truly imperfect, something that is feels like a word vomit, right? And kind of run with it and see where that takes you. See what happens if you allow yourself the mental space to think about later creating the second draft, the third draft, and so forth, right? The next thing that I'm thinking about with regards to working with Mercury is you really can't be a savior to other people. Sometimes you can't even save yourself, right? There's something really powerful when we move out of this idea of us being able to save things or people. As the ruler of Virgo, Mercury has this inherent orientation towards service, right? Mercury is also traditionally what we call exalted in Virgo, right? On top of being in domicile. So in other words, Mercury shines and Mercury gets a lot of accolades in the land of Virgo. But when is orienting towards service potentially detrimental? I can think about a couple instances or kind of large umbrellas of potential categories of when orienting towards service can be confusing or completely ineffective, right? One is when we abandon our own inspiration, our own instincts, our own calling. And the other one is when we are doing it out of a sense of obligation that isn't really in alignment with who we are, right? I like to think that part of our most radiant, our most potent gifts is to listen to our own calling, our own inspiration, and then to find ways to translate that to be in service to other people. This is obviously very different than tuning everybody out, right? Or rushing out to find out what everybody wants before checking in with yourself and what your heart is really calling you towards. This is one of the many middle paths, right? One of the many middle paths is for us to really kind of play in this game of listening to our desires and feeling into how we can translate these desires to be something that can be useful for other people, right? And then the next point is this idea that a life well explored may be infinitely more interesting, more alive than a life that's well lived. Who's to say that you lived well or not? The answer is you do, right? You get to decide whether you lived your life well or not. And if you run around having weird standards for yourself, know that that's probably programming, and therefore it's likely that it's very possible to reverse that programming. There's something here about understanding that you get to kind of chart your own path, and you get to create your own standards in life, and you create your own punchlines, essentially. There's also nothing wrong with kind of toying around with ideas, bouncing ideas off of other people, testing things out, creating beta versions, and writing many, many, many bad drafts, right? This is something I've already kind of alluded to earlier. But in working with Mercury, moving away from the orientation of perfection, including the perfection of one's process, is to me really key here. Sometimes we might think, oh, I am not someone who orients towards perfection, right? Like, I get that I need to kind of play around and explore before finally getting to something that I can be happy with. But there are times when I've certainly noticed this in myself, where I don't allow myself the grace of being in process with something. Part of being in process with something is that your ideas may come to you in a flash. There may be this kind of radiant, glorious purity to how the idea or the inspiration comes through you. And then once you start figuring out, how can I make this a reality? It may be really challenging for you to do that. I'm currently in one of these processes myself. I'm feeling into an idea that I've been, let's say, visited by for a while. And as I'm considering how I can translate this into something tangible, into something that I can share with other people, it's proving to be very challenging. And the idea is numinous. The idea kind of has a lot of different branches, and it's taking me a while. And I also really need to get support. I really need to reach out to people who can help me talk through this, right? And hear my own process kind of coming out in words, and letting myself be witness in a little bit of that messiness in front of a group of people that I trust, right? There's something here that, being a Virgo rising for me, I've had to learn to reckon with the fact that sometimes my process just takes a lot longer than I would like it to. And that I can also have fun with that process, right? Pivoting can feel less scary if you see it as an experiment, right? Sometimes you might get certain ideas, and as you continue to develop the idea, it's wanting to turn into something else. And that can feel really scary if you're very married to the idea, right? If you're really kind of attached to how it's supposed to look, it can feel really disorienting, when it starts to shift and evolve in the ways that it naturally can when you start poking around, when you start spending time with it, right? How many times in our human relationships have we experienced this? How many times have you met someone and have a specific impression or idea or projection of them, and as you continue to talk to them and you continue to build relationship, maybe you start getting coffee, right? Or you kind of talk a little bit more deeply about your home life or your interests, your work, you start to discover, hey, actually this person isn't who I imagined them to be, right? To me, this kind of happens all the time. I think ideas are very similar. I think that our creative projects are very similar because sometimes they come to us, right, and they look a certain way, they smell a certain way, they have this certain aura about them. And I think part of building a relationship with our ideas that are healthy is to trust that as we get to know them, they evolve in front of us, right? Or our perception of them evolves. And so that may completely change the way that we work with them. And finally, what I want to share with regards to working with Mercury, working with a trickster, is that the only devotion that really matters is your commitment to your craft, to your projects, to your people, right? You get to define what devotion looks like. You get to define what commitment looks like. One of the gifts of the trickster is that the trickster teaches you how to make up your own rule. You get to ask what matters for you. You get to ask what your value systems are, and then you get to practice honesty and integrity along the way, right? You can, I think there's a lot of honesty and integrity required in living authentically, in living not by someone else's rules, but by your own. Because at any point, you might face challenges. You might find that other people respond a certain way. And then you have to kind of get clear with yourself about, what is my intention, truly? Is there something I'm not seeing here? And if there's something that I'm not seeing, can I give myself the grace to see that and to decide the next steps based on that witnessing? On the other hand, if I know what my intentions are, I can also probably safely conclude that my being, my presence, my actions have an impact on other people, right? And sometimes people just don't like it. And that's okay. They also get to have their own experience about your presence. It may totally suck, right? Emotionally, that may feel really painful. But at the same time, that's life, truly. And that's what it means to be human, living with other humans. All right, I hope this is helpful. I hope this is giving you something to consider, something to work with during this coming week as the Gemini energy heightens and as we maybe disperse into our explorations and maybe try out new things. I hope that some of these contemplations are useful for you. If you would like to work with me one-on-one, I would love that opportunity. My books are currently closed until June 17th. And so if you would like to get in and you would like to have some one-on-one sessions with me, have your birth chart read, or do a divination session, or do some subtle realm alchemy or energy work together, I would love to do that. Information is on the show notes below. All the links are there. And if you have enjoyed this podcast, I would love for you to share it with others within your community. It really helps so much to hear from all of you, and you sharing about the podcast is literally the number one way that this work gets out there. So if you've benefited from this work, I would love to receive your help in getting it out there. All right. Thank you so much. I will see you again very soon. Take care.